Back when I was younger and all I was doing was watching Beyblade and playing on my Nintendo DS, all I cared about was finding the coolest character in whatever game I was playing at the time. It was especially bad in Smash Bros. Brawl. I just have to admit that game just was way too cool, and if you were like 6 years old when you first saw that cover art, you know exactly what I mean. There were always certain characters that just stood out. If a character had the right look, the right attitude, and maybe even a sick weapon, that was like all I needed. I was sold instantly. But with all of that in mind, let's kick things off with a character who didn't just shape my childhood. I genuinely think that this character is so undeniably cool that he fundamentally changed my brain chemistry. When I was a kid, like 7 or 8, I was absolutely hooked on this game that wasn't Mario Kart, but felt close enough. It was Sega's take on the kart racer formula. If you've played Mario Kart, you know how smooth and polished it is. This game, yeah, not so much. I remember it feeling really clunky, especially the drifting. But honestly, I didn't care. This game had one of the coolest rosters of playable characters of all time, especially to me back then. I didn't know most of them, but come on, they just look really cool. But the main reason why this game is so important to me and why I played it so much is because we get to play as one specific character. A character who at the time I only knew as a side character, and I've seen it in like maybe 1 or 2 games, but I never got to play as him. And that one is Shadow the Hedgehog. This was my first time ever getting to play as Shadow, and let me tell you, I was obsessed. This was me controlling the coolest character I've ever seen. Sonic himself is arguably one of the coolest characters of all time, and Shadow being this dark version of him with his red highlights, it was just so cool. He's mysterious, he's dark, he's edgy. He's like all the things that 7-year-old me thought was peak coolness. Shadow was basically the coolest thing I ever saw growing up, and probably still is. Well, except for that one Beyblade episode where they like go to hell and fight Cerberus. That one also fundamentally changed me, but I think we should get back to Shadow. There's this one cutscene from the Shadow the Hedgehog video game with Shadow on like a motorcycle with a gun driving through the city and just shooting at things. And when I was a kid, I didn't care what anyone said about the game's quality. This was like the peak gaming, peak coolness. It was peak of everything. I was spending hours just looking at fan art, watching AMVs on YouTube. I barely knew anything about his backstory at the time, but I didn't need to. He just looked cool and he was cool, and that was enough for me back then. I could go on and on about his backstory, but you probably know the deal by now. Him being this ultimate life form and his purpose being tied to Maria, and then her dying right in front of him. He thinks Maria wanted revenge and chaos and destruction, so he sets out on this dark path, believing that's his purpose, which again is really cool. He's this lone wolf, acting out of anger, confusion and pain. And now comes the part that makes Shadow like 10 times cooler than he already is. At the very end, Shadow chooses to live for himself. He decides to walk his own path, and I think that's like the coolest thing you could do. It's not about the bike or the gun, even though those are pretty cool. It's about him choosing to live life on his own terms, and that's the coolest thing ever. But I can't stop talking about Shadow without mentioning Super Shadow. And look, I know, it's predictable to say he's cool. He's Shadow, but in like Super Saiyan, Vegeta kind of way. It's obviously really cool. There are also some really cool and deep moments with Super Shadow, but let's be real. When I was 8, none of that deep stuff mattered to me. I could transform into Super Shadow in my kart racing game. That was cool. And that's all that mattered. And now, something I want to mention really quickly at the very end is that Shadow in Sonic and the Black Knight is probably the coolest character of all time. I know most people despise the game, but it's one of my favorite Sonic games. I will make a video on it someday, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but one of the main reasons is because of all the sick character designs. I mean, look at Shadow. They managed to make him even cooler by giving him this armor, this big sword, and turning him into a legendary knight. There's nothing you can hate about that. Back when I was a kid, I would replay the boss fight with Shadow over and over again just because it was the coolest thing ever. the next character might come as a surprise to you, or maybe you're a man of culture and it doesn't come as a surprise to you. Let's talk about Bowser. Now I know, Bowser, the guy who kidnaps the princess or whatever, very cool, and yeah, you're not wrong. But in my opinion, Bowser is way more than just some classic boring bad guy. I think the thing that makes Bowser so cool is that Nintendo is not afraid to take his character into very weird and very cool directions. Like, look at Dry Bowser. Bowser gets dropped into lava and he comes back as this fire-breathing skeleton. I don't have anything to say about it other than it's really cool. Dry Bowser is probably the most metal thing Nintendo has ever done. Then there's Fury Bowser, which is like Dry Bowser, but somehow even cooler. It's like a mixture of Bowser and Shin Godzilla, just wrecking everything like a total beast, and to fight him, you have to collect this big bell and then turn into this big Super Saiyan cat and beat his ass. It's really cool. But those are both not my favorite versions of Bowser. I want to talk about a version of Bowser from Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story. If you've never played this game before, just looking at some screenshots, you would not expect this game to have any crazy cool boss fight. That's the same impression I was under back when I was like, I think 7 or 8 when we picked this game up at a local flea market. But then you get to the final boss fight that absolutely blew my mind when I was a kid, and it still gives me chills nowadays. And his name is Dark Bowser. And I remember back then I was thinking that this is like the coolest thing I've ever seen. He got this incredibly cool look with his skin being all blue, shell being blue, and him having a mohawk.
I'd be crying if I looked like that too, bro.
It's like they took everything cool about Bowser and just made it even cooler. The way they took Bowser, who's already this larger-than-life villain, and turned him into something darker and more sinister, it was a game changer for me back then. His backstory is pretty simple. There's this thing called the Dark Star, which is like an ancient evil, and it absorbs Bowser's DNA and creates a shadowy, twisted version of him.
Number 12, cock.
So it wasn't just a reskin of Bowser, it was Bowser if you went completely off the deep end. You're up against what Bowser could have been if he embraced all the worst parts of himself. And the thing I just have to mention, because it's almost as cool as his design. The music goes so insanely hard in this boss fight. Just listen to it. It's probably one of the coolest final boss fights of all time, and that coming from a Mario and Luigi game is insane. But again, let's be real, the thing that hooked me as a kid was not how cool the contrast between Dark Bowser and Bowser was, or what was at stake. It was how cool he looked. I didn't need to know about all the dark themes and all that stuff. He was just really cool, and he felt like the ultimate villain. So yeah, Dark Bowser is definitely a character that stuck with me, and he's also definitely one of the coolest video game characters I know. The next character is probably the most well-known character on this whole list. Well, okay, no, Shadow is like maybe even more famous, but it's Kratos. Now, Kratos isn't just cool because he got muscles and he swings around those iconic blades, which basically just means he's like Toji, but for gamers. I mean, yeah, sure, in like the original 3 games, he was just rage in human form. Kratos was a Spartan general who got tricked by Ares, the god of war, and then he accidentally killed his own family. And I think you know how the rest plays out. There's so many cool things I could mention about the original 3 games, but the thing I want to mention the most is you fight Poseidon at the very start of God of War 3, and Kratos kills Poseidon while you are watching the fight in first person from Poseidon's perspective. Like, that fight alone made you realize that this guy was not playing around. He was killing gods left and right, just casually wiping the floor with them. And obviously, let's not forget the moment when he climbs all the way to the top of Mount Olympus to square up with Zeus himself, which is one of the most intense final battles in gaming. Just really epic and cool. Those moments make Kratos the coolest character you could think of. I remember back as a kid, every time I saw like a commercial or a game cover with him on it, he just looked really cool and I desperately wanted to play it. But I never had a PlayStation until I was like 14 or 15. So I had to make do with, I don't know, like that one Kung Fu Panda game for the drawing tablet on the Wii. But that's not where the story of Kratos ends. God of War has had a resurgence recently, with 2 sequels releasing in the past few years. And he's not just the God of War anymore, he's a dad now. The moment he starts talking to Atreus, you can see that he's like a whole new man. He still has all the anger inside of him, they didn't retcon that. But underneath all of that, you've got this guy who's just trying to raise his son. He's trying to teach Atreus how to be strong, but not strong in the way Kratos used to be. That's just a really interesting dynamic, and it's what makes the new games so good. And again, it's not like Kratos suddenly got soft. The man still knows how to fight. Ragnarok really brings his character arc full circle. By the end of Ragnarok, Kratos has become so much more than what he was in the past. There's this one scene near the very end where Kratos finds out this prophecy about him, and it's heartbreakingly beautiful. You can see this guy who has spent his entire life being feared, finally realizing that he could be something more. It's one of those moments where you feel like Kratos has finally evolved into something greater. It's that balance that makes him so cool. He's got this brutal power, ripping enemies apart with blades of chaos, but there's more to him. He's not just fighting for revenge, he's fighting for something bigger. And that's what makes Kratos one of the most legendary characters in gaming. And you know, his backstory is all cool and sad and very complex and very cool, and I could make like a 10-hour analysis on his beautiful bald head, but the fact of the matter is, he's not just cool because of his backstory, he's also just cool because he is cool. Look at him, his tattoos, his weapon, Kratos is him. The next character I want to talk about is one of, if not the coolest character from the Souls games, Knight Artorias. Artorias is basically just a really cool knight with a massive sword, and honestly, that's enough for me to think he's really cool. But his boss fight is something else. It's one of my favorite boss fights in the whole Soul franchise. Even though it's nothing special, it feels like you're playing against another player, and I love boss fights like that. I remember it was one of the very few fights where I was hoping that I wouldn't beat him too fast because I was having so much fun. But there's something else that makes him really cool. It's not just his looks, it's not just the boss fight, it's his backstory. Now look, getting into Dark Souls lore is like making this video 10 hours long, but basically he was sent to stop the Abyss, which is this dark corrupt force that was about to consume the land. And here's the thing, he failed. But even while being consumed by the Abyss, he still fought to protect what he loved, which was his wolf companion Sif. But again, as I've said already, let's be real for a second. Just look at him. His design is enough to get hyped about. The sword is also another reason why I think he's really cool. As we've already established with Shadow the Hedgehog, the easiest way to make a character really cool is to give him a really big sword. He just swings this giant slab of metal around like it's nothing. Bro has read way too much Berserk. One minute he's leaping across the battlefield with this massive sword, and then the next he's spinning and rolling with insane speed. I mentioned a wolf companion called Sif before, and Sif is also one of the coolest characters in this game. Sif is a giant wolf with a giant sword in his mouth, and you have to fight him. I don't even need to say more. It's just really cool. But all the exterior coolness aside, it's not just about how cool he looks, it's also about why he's fighting. Because the fight with Sif takes place after Artorias falls to the Abyss, meaning that Sif takes up the sword of Artorias and then guards his grave, protecting anyone from falling to the same corruption. And the whole fight hits really hard. Sif does not want to kill you, he's trying to stop you from becoming like Artorias, and if you've played the DLC and saved Sif before, Sif even hesitates before attacking you. So yeah, Artorias isn't just cool because he's got badass armor and a massive sword, but that's definitely like a big part. He's cool because his whole story, his fight, his presence, it's all tragic and epic at the same time. You're not just fighting a knight, you're fighting a legend, someone who's been through hell and still keeps going. And this perseverance to always keep going and to fight for what's right, I think it is really cool. Originally, Artorias would have been the last guy I talk about, but there is one guy that I just want to mention so very briefly. He's just objectively so cool that I have to mention him in this video. Yeah, let's talk about the Doomslayer. I won't talk about backstory. He doesn't even really talk much. He's just literally here to rip and tear through anything unfortunate enough to cross his path. This guy literally walks into hell and starts killing demons. There's no drama, there's no tragic origin story, it's just pure rage and carnage. He's not really here to make you think, he's just here to make you feel like a badass. Honestly, that's what makes him so cool. All the other characters are cool on the outside, and then you learn about their backstory and that makes them even cooler, but Doomslayer doesn't need that. He doesn't need emotional complexity, he doesn't need a tragic hero's journey. He's just an unstoppable force of nature in heavy armor, smashing demons' faces in. If that's not cool, then, you know, I don't know what is. The thing about these characters is, they are more than just iconic or cool designs or memorable quotes.
Disgusting black creatures, get out of my sight.
They are characters we connect with on a deeper level. They inspire us, even if it's just for a moment. They didn't have to be good guys, and they didn't have to be bad guys. They just had to be cool. And that's all that really mattered to me. We've covered a lot of characters in this video, and I think the main thing that connects all of them is that they are fighting for something bigger than themselves. And a lot of them really lean into the anti-hero or villain role. You know, the ones who just do what they want when they want because they are really cool and edgy. But I think it's important to realize that coolness isn't just about being edgy or being reckless. And that's really what I've been getting at throughout this whole video. Coolness can come in all shapes and forms. It's not always about being aggressive or rebellious. Sometimes it's quite the opposite.
Atreus.
Sometimes being cool just means walking your own path.
I am sorry.
I'm sure you all had that one game back when you were a kid. The one you played so much it became a part of you. For me that was Sonic and All-Stars Racing. It's not even my favorite game from my childhood, but I must have spent so many hours racing as Shadow, just thinking I was the coolest kid on the planet. And honestly, in my own little world, I probably was, even if just for a moment. And that's really what video games are all about, right? They take us back to those simpler times, to that feeling of being a kid and believing anything was possible. These characters remind us of who we were, who we are, and who we want to be. If you got any characters that I didn't mention in this video that made you feel the same way, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And hey, while you're at it, maybe, you know, subscribe, bell notification, all of that. I've like 0 subscribers at this point. Thank you for hanging out with me today. It really means a lot. I hope you enjoyed your stay, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Stay cool. Peace.